All right, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of the Security Engineering Show, the #1 show for security engineers by real security engineers. I'm Noah Stanford. Joining me is a good friend of mine, the malware man himself, Michael Grube. He's done it all from reversing North Korean malware to running everything anti-malware for years at SpaceX. So, Michael, you mentioned a few projects to me that I thought would be awesome for the first episode of the podcast. Our podcast today is called Oh, the Places You Can Find Malware, starring some North Korean malware you found at a previous job, some backdoors in a Hadoop cluster, as well as some wonderful malware running on a water jet machine, of all things.
So, just to touch on the first one, I think, I picked these three incidents because I think they all have interesting lessons that people can learn. The first one, I'll start with is the malware that was running on a Hadoop cluster. So the story behind this is at a previous employer, we had a Hadoop cluster that was generally used for any kind of large data processing. And essentially, it was very well resourced, but there was no spending on monitoring of any kind, really. And as a result, eventually there were problems. So
Unimportant things, right?
yeah. What ended up happening was one day the SOC of the place of this previous employer noticed some unusual traffic coming from the cluster and asked somebody who was a little bit more familiar with the cluster environment to take a look. And that was me. So I took a look and found some unusual processes that were running. The attackers kind of cleverly, it's sort of a standard trick, but to a system administrator, it looks legit, cleverly named their service systemd. So just, it wasn't, the thing is, it wasn't running as root or anything. It was just running as a normal user. So that's kind of your first giveaway there. The goal of this malware, or what this malware did, was connect over Tor to an Ethereum mining pool. And essentially, this was the malware itself the functionality was relatively straightforward. Simply deploy a miner, in this case, XMRig, and relay the mining results over a Tor gateway. So just like a regular clear text website that relays traffic between Tor and users. So the goal of the malware was relatively simple, but to me, the interesting part of this was how kind of soft the attack surface was. The way this malware got in there was, we never found the exact original origin, but the way this malware installed itself was through a misconfiguration in completely standard misconfiguration in the scheduling software for the Hadoop cluster called Yarn. And if you look online, you'll see that actually Yarn is a repeating issue for Hadoop clusters. So essentially what happened was it abused a misconfiguration in Yarn, created Hadoop jobs, installed a new process on each machine and kind of like one for each core, and made it look like, oh, I'm systemd. And then I think at the very end, they use something like nice, which is a really cheap way to make your process not look suspicious, but in many cases, it does the job. So after, taking a look at this thing, determining, breaking out, Hadoop typically runs on Linux. So after breaking out GDB, after figuring out, hey, this systemd isn't the real systemd, and taking a look at it, it was packed with some custom packer that the closest code I could find on the internet to it was a packer somebody wrote that for some reason worked on PlayStation 4. I'm not really sure what the connection there was, but that was the closest thing I could find on the internet, at least. But it was relatively simple, as with all things packed, you just run the code, you let it create the new process. You don't care about the decryption algorithm. You just let it decrypt. And then when it's at the right time, you just grab it from memory, and then what the actual payload executable does. So not particularly advanced. I wouldn't say it was really sophisticated, but I think, it ran in the Hadoop cluster for definitely months, probably 6 or 8 months minimum, and before anyone noticed anything. So that's at the time at least, that was probably some decent money and relatively simple thing. So I think that's a good example for people to pull off, because you see in any kind of high performance computing, forget Spark and Hadoop, forget Yarn and Hadoop for a minute. The common theme you see in high performance computing environments is trust, because you basically have people who performance is everything. That's all they care about. They don't even have time to think about stuff like security, and it kind of falls to the wayside, and people care, okay, well, how are my simulations doing? How is my AI model training? That's what they care about. And they don't think about who has access to this cluster. What is this cluster exposed to? Definitely, there's like, in any environment where performance is important, people do not want to spend CPU on monitoring of any kind. And unfortunately, that means that probably many clusters out there have been compromised for years, and the owners don't know, I would guess.
Yeah, it's makes me think of, will the real system D please stand up, It's
Yeah.
just finding it running on there. So I guess one of the things I immediately think of when you first told me this story is, the fact that it seems like the threat actor was the North Korean government. I know they're very creative when it comes to how they actually get money, considering they don't have a great global economy or global economic presence. So how did you guys actually do attribution at first for this malware?
So this one actually wasn't the North Korean one. We think
Yes, sorry.
yeah, it's okay. We think that it was probably an insider, but it's really, we only had guesses.
Yeah, it makes sense. I imagine if you're looking to mine Bitcoin, you just target your own company's HPC cluster, and that does the job. And like you said, nobody's trying to spend monitoring cycles on this.
That's right.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of other companies where some of the more hardware-based software engineering that was happening around maybe real-world things like rockets, folks don't want to actually put monitoring software on because it'll destroy performance, right?
Yeah, that's what you'd expect. Yeah.
So I guess talk a little bit about, what you guys did to actually, I guess, discover it in the first place. I imagine noticing System D wasn't running as root was part of it. But, after you guys did discover this and you started debugging with GDB, what were some of the recovery steps you guys ran through?
So we actually re-imaged and then sold the hardware, the cluster.
That's an easy fix, I guess.
I personally felt like it was an overreaction, to be honest, but that's what happened.
Yeah, it reminds me of a good friend of ours beating a printer with a bat because we printed a private key from it to make sure we had a copy of it in a safe. And then, you want to make sure they can't recover it from the printer. So don't just toss the printer, just beat it to death, I guess.
Makes sense, I guess, yeah.
So I guess to touch a little bit on the North Korean malware, do you want to go into a bit of, maybe a brief synopsis of what that malware actually is and how you guys came to discover it?
I think, I really like this story. I think it's interesting. So the place where I worked had a mechanical engineering lab. And one day, one of the employees came in and they were just doing their work. And they noticed that the computer was logged in and the keyboard was switched to Korean. And the problem with this is that none of the people in the lab, no one in the building even, was Korean. And that was kind of odd at first, and I think people assumed, okay, well, it's just some kind of fluke or something. But people decided it was odd enough to report it, and they did. So the SOC took a closer look at it, and there started to be more questions the further they dug in. There was software running that they were not at all familiar with. They don't know, even really, they couldn't make a trail of how it got there. And it wasn't even really clear what it was doing. It's just that there was a suspiciously placed Python interpreter and script inside of a user folder in Windows for a user that nobody was associated with. And it was running all the time. And it essentially launched another process that would do DLL injection into a lot of other processes. So the main question at the beginning is like, what is this and how did it get here? Again, at the time, we didn't immediately jump to the North Korea conclusion.
Never do.
Right. Yeah, it's dangerous to jump to conclusions like that. So we just kind of kept digging into it. And again, actually, I did the reverse engineering for this, and it was honestly the payload on the machine was relatively straightforward to take apart. It was a variant of a popular Trojan at the time, at least, called Ramnet. It was a modified version of that. And I noticed that a few things popped out at me. So what Ramnet does is it allows the user to search for files, to send files that are on the machine, and it pretty much is designed to only use FTP. So it takes these files or whatever data is interesting, and it sends it over FTP somewhere. But something else was a little bit interesting too, and I thought this seemed pretty smart to me at the time. I noticed that for communication, it was resolving a huge list of domains, just like a gigantic list of domains. And the weirder thing is that I actually recognized some of them. And if you're a nation state, this actually makes total sense because obviously, if you want a reliable proxy that's hard to trace, you compromise, less secure websites and
Known
then
ones too.
simply, yeah, and then use those as your proxy, maybe add some additional layers in between there. And that alone should make attribution pretty tough for almost everyone. So, but that it appeared that's what they were doing. And truly, like this is a true story, one of the domains was owned by somebody that I actually knew. And so I contacted them. They looked into it, but they couldn't find anything, which I thought was interesting. But essentially, I did the reversing on it. Pretty much confirmed that yeah, there's spyware on this machine. It wasn't really clear how it got there, and I made a report all the domains it resolved, some of the traffic that was coming out of the box, and what I thought it was doing. And after that, I just kind of assumed my job was done and moved on. But actually, the FBI contacted us saying that, hey, like, have you guys seen anything weird lately? We actually think that North Korea wants information from you guys. And so we were like, oh, and now that you mention it, we had this whole incident in our mechanical engineering lab.
We have, in fact, found a Korean malware laying around recently.
Yeah. That would explain the Korean keyboard. The story actually gets more interesting, in my opinion, because after we were basically told, okay, this is some state-sponsored hacking activity, and they were specifically targeting a lab's work that they're probably interested in replicating the work there. But it got more interesting because, being the IR person at the time, the question is, well, okay, then how did it get there? And to be totally honest, the conclusion I came to was that the only way it could have gotten there is that somebody with elevated privileges in AD, like a domain admin, could have really put it there and not left any kind of trail the way they did. So this admittedly is a guess, but it felt to me like, oh, the compromise is probably deeper than we think it is. So I also looked for additional stuff. I actually took the box apart and you can get Raspberry Pi and use the GPIO pins to use something called SPI, and you can actually dump the BIOS of a computer. So I actually did all that. And I saw some unusual stuff. First of all, the BIOS image wasn't the same as the standard that we were using. The UEFI image wasn't the same, but it also wasn't that different. And in fact, to be honest, I could not tell why the checksum was off. It wasn't apparent to me what the significant difference was, but it was pretty clear to me that, North Korea probably inside the network, probably have elevated privileges, probably did something pretty advanced. And unfortunately, I think
hanging out with DA, just hanging out with domain admin, right?
Yeah, I really think so. And unfortunately, the response from leadership was, you know, okay, well, we can't prove anything, just move on. And at the time, I think a learning lesson from this is if you don't have an answer like that, you should probably dig a little bit deeper.
Yeah, I guess on that note, like, let's say from the beginning you could do something differently. Like, what would you have done differently?
Isolate that computer immediately. That's what should have happened. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes
Isolate
sense.
the computer immediately. And I would have liked to have moved it into a different environment to see if I would like to have spent the time to figure out what triggers the payload that they were using. And really, you know, being honest, the only reason we found it is because one of their operators was sloppy and
Right.
accidentally stayed logged in, right? That's
Right.
why we found it.
And I think that was the interesting part that I took away too is if the Korean keyboard wasn't there, what do you think would have been the later recognition for it, if anything?
I don't think there would have been one.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. And one of the things that I took away, just backtracking a little bit, was that they decided to immediately deploy a Python interpreter of all things to the machine and then run Python scripts, a language notorious for being easily reversible. Even if you compile it, you can get the source code from it. What do you think may have been their thought process there?
I think they thought it was an easy way for stage one. And I think the first stage of their malware, I think it looks innocent enough. They did schedule the Python process plus script that launches a service.
Like
They did schedule
WMI or
that.
something?
I forgot the exact details, but it was that part started with a scheduled task on Windows
Right.
and it was on boot. So I think their logic for that, if I had to guess, would be, one, we know this initial stage works everywhere and it looks innocent. It looks like python.exe, right? Many places run python.exe. Maybe even some major hardware producers run Python a lot.
Yeah, and I think on that note, that's an interesting thing I think we've seen together in EDR testing in the past is that reverse shells like Meterpreter would be immediately eaten by an EDR, but if you started your reverse shell via like the Python interpreter itself, it would almost just pass through for like 1 out of 5 or 4 out of 5 EDRs would just let it go.
Yeah, that's unfortunately true. And I think a big lesson that the industry feels reluctant to learn is that a lot of these static signatures that everyone relies on, while they can reliably catch things that are very well known and that is useful, the second as the attacker you start significantly modifying your payloads, you're going to make it a couple more steps than you would have. And sometimes that's enough. So the real power of good defensive software, in my opinion, lies much more on the behavioral side. Although good static signatures can be useful, but I think behavioral detection is where it's at.
Yeah, and I think that's something we've seen a lot over the last few years is folks trying to move away from doing static or signature-based analysis towards something more heuristic that can really detect the bad behavior rather than the recognizable piece of code. I guess, what was the final takeaway? Like, what did you guys do to actually clean this up at the end?
Well, I would have liked a different response, but essentially they simply imaged the machine and went on their business, kind of a disappointing response. I think that's another thing is a lot of SOCs and security decision makers, I'll say, I think they feel pressured and they often don't know what to do. And the safe option comes back to them. Oh, just image it. But especially for stuff like this, you can't just bury your head in the sand and pretend everything's okay.
Yeah, I mean, especially with the state-sponsored actor, if anything, they're just going to become wiser from that and realize the mistakes they made and maybe clean up. And I imagine you guys, you probably started monitoring a little bit harder after this, but did you ever see them again on the network?
Nope.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess that's a good takeaway. It's something I was thinking about for sure is, especially if maybe they have some, I want to say domain-wide privileges, right? Some very high escalated privileges. Imaging the machine may be, like you said, it's not a satisfactory response. But to that point, if they did become wiser afterwards, it's almost up to finding new IOCs to actually be able to see if they've come back.
Yeah, I think things are changing positively in that there's the role called a threat hunter now, which they kind of proactively look for unusual behavior. I do think that's a really good defense against actually even state sponsored stuff. So I think, being proactive about looking for unusual activity combined with using behavioral detections and not just kind of relying on what you don't know as sort of a safe point,
Yeah. And as sort of like the specialization, I think, in cybersecurity roles break down, I think, in days of old, people were just cybersecurity experts, so to speak, but nowadays they're becoming a lot more specialized roles like these threat hunters. What advice would you give to maybe some of the smaller companies, like, let's say, a 20-person defense company that's facing an issue like this that doesn't have a dedicated security program? How would you sort of appeal to maybe even C-level or board to get them to start thinking about these things?
I would say their product is obviously of immediate interest to people who are much more skilled and resourced than they have time to consider.
But it can't be us,
And
right? We're only a 20-person company.
that is the trap. You're so right about that. People think there's a misconception. I'm sure people will disagree with this, but there's a misconception out there. There's somebody, I think his name is like Malware Jake or something, and he has this thing that he said a while ago that everyone latched onto, which is like, oh, a nation state's not going to use 0 days on you. You're not important enough. Maybe that's how the NSA thinks about things. That is not how everyone thinks about things. They don't care who you are. They don't sit around and think, oh, is this person important? They don't care about you or your ego or any of this stuff. They don't care. They want the information. They don't care about your company. Like, they don't care. So yeah, definitely, if you're just a 20-person startup, if it's a 20-person startup developing something related to something that they care about, they're going to use it. And they're probably going to get away with it because, they know that you don't have good resources, right?
Yeah. And I think before we get into our next topic, it's an interesting thing to dive into, because when we see, and something I know you're really familiar with nowadays is like the ransomware scene. It's like when we look at these ransomware actors, they're just looking for low-hanging fruit. And I don't think that the amount of companies that actually are of interest to these foreign threat actors are as small as the companies seem to think they are. They seem to think if you're not MGM, you're not the guy getting breached. But I guess what would you think about that? Like, what should folks start thinking about going into this next age of having distributed ransomware as a service groups running on the internet?
The cheapest and most effective thing you can do is reduce attack surface. If it shouldn't be on the internet, leave it off the internet. For God's sake, leave it off the internet. And if you have, like cloud resources, it's worth the time to be thorough. I know that setting up strong identity can be a pain, but it's absolutely worth it. It does make these attacks much more difficult. So for cloud infrastructure, I would say invest the time and resources in, having a strong authentication mechanism and everything else. Leave as few places exposed as you can, so that can act as sort of like a choke point for traffic, for unusual behavior, because at least that way, your work is much more manageable. So that would be my recommendation for people with less resources: is leave things offline when you can, create an isolated network if you can afford to, and use things like YubiKeys.
And would you think it's useful for these folks to maybe even have like a dedicated security hire? I think one of the things I've realized a lot when talking to companies between 5 to 100 employees is that they don't see security as a cost center that they need today. Like one day they'll be big enough to have security, but when do you think people should start hiring security?
I'd say right away. I know we're both security people, so we might be a little
We're
bit
biased.
biased,
Yeah.
but I would argue that unless the team is a team of extremely competent developers who are already thinking about security, which is rare,
Rare. Right.
then I would say that you should have one person who can help you make decisions now that will save you time and energy later. I think as soon as you start, if you have if you have two developers, I think you should have a security person.
No, it definitely makes sense. I think, like you said, we're security people, so we're probably a little bit biased in this industry. But I definitely think I resonate with it to the fact that, you may be a target, especially if you're in a security critical industry, and there is no time better than the present to not end up in, a news article somewhere. We're seeing it left and right.
That's right.
So probably one of the most interesting, and I think I always call them the most interesting because seeing OT or ICS environments get breached it really speaks to the real world consequences of this. Tell me a little bit about the story of the compromised water jet machine.
Yeah. So I think this is a case where I was being proactive and looking for unusual traffic. And uh, at a previous employer, there we had just installed some a new network monitoring software, and essentially, in my spare cycles, I would look through the traffic to see, think like a malware developer, like what should I look for? And one day, I found some indications that there was a machine on the network that was trying to reach out to a domain that was known to be malicious, known to be a command and control domain. And there's not really any question about it. You did the research on it. It was definitely a command and control domain.
Can you explain to the audience what a C2 or command and control domain is?
Sure. Yeah. So a command and control domain would be a domain name that points to a server for malware to communicate information, to send and receive commands. So essentially, you have the malware network operator who maintains some kind of server infrastructure on the internet. They have a domain name which points to that infrastructure, and that way, all of their installed malware can resolve that domain name and immediately get contact with their command and control system, so that they can know who they've infected, get information about what's on the computer, see if there's anything else interesting on the network that they're on, and move from there. After some digging, I worked with the SOC a little bit to figure out, where's this coming from? We have pretty good reason to believe this is bad. Where's it coming from? And it was actually operating on a computer that controlled a water jet, which, was, to my knowledge, was just purchased directly from the manufacturer, which is by itself interesting. And it was purchased some time ago, so it wasn't a recent compromise. And I don't think that we would have seen this normally. The good news in that case was that this malware operating on a network that was isolated, it was trying to use DNS to resolve the name, which is how we saw the unusual traffic, but other traffic was not able to enter or leave the network. So it was kind of nice. It was on a VLAN, and that made it, at least it was contained in that regard. And we did check the details, and I think it had been some time since other malware was reporting in to the known bad domain. So
Right.
that was a case of not too much damage, but still quite interesting that it was living on the hardware and trying to move around on an isolated network.
So when you say trying to move around, I imagine you're referring to some sort of autopwn or like worming behavior. Can you talk a bit through, what you saw it trying to probe for, perhaps?
My memory's a little bit fuzzy on the propagation behavior. I think it was just standard. I think it was just standard looking around for network shares, just general Windows tactics. To be honest, I kind of forgot those details.
Yeah, no worries at all. It's hard to remember any sort of propagation after WannaCry. It destroys it destroys everyone's networks, right? You see Eternal Blue auto pop every SMB running machine on the network, and that's the only thing I can think of in the current day that's actually had some sort of behavior like that. So,
Yep.
so you referred before to the machine, you know, to the network settings really only allowing for DNS. Do you think the attackers were aware of this limitation before?
No, I doubt it. It feels like an opportunistic attack. It felt like either the supplier was compromised or the supplier was malicious. And assuming the scenario where the supplier was simply compromised, I think the attacker's logic would just be, if we ship this, if we get this on in the software and the customers install it, will be on all their customers. That there was no indication that it was specifically targeted. So my default assumption is that it was an opportunistic supplier compromise from some time ago.
It makes sense. And I think after seeing like it's something we've seen a lot in operational environments before, and I think it's especially probably more common in OT environments. Suppliers basically having their supplier USB that's allowed to install the software for the device, and then somehow that supplier USB just happened to ship with malware. I guess what are your thoughts around that after probably seeing that a few times throughout your career?
I think that people are dangerously naive to this possibility. I think people saw the whole solar winds thing and thought, oh, wow, this is such a special event. This never happens. It happens all the time.
Right.
It happens all the time in many different ways. Some threat actors will backdoor popular IT tools and then use search engines to prioritize their websites so that totally well-meaning IT person just wants to download the tool, they download it, and it's backdoored, right? That happens today, and that has been happening. But that's just one example. It's not even happening now. It has been happening for some time. So I think it's like people are dangerously naive to the possibility that the completely legitimate software that they either purchased or came with their stuff or whatever, could be compromised, and it wouldn't take for a player that was playing long enough, it wouldn't take the resources of Russia or the United States or China. It wouldn't take those resources. It would just take some patience.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I mean, honestly, in the day of ransomware actors playing the long game or even trying to do large scale phishing campaigns like Octotempest did with Octopus, it does seem to pay off to be patient once you land on an environment.
That's absolutely right.
Sweet. So I guess a bit on that point as well is, what do you think most folks are looking for from an attacker perspective once they actually do manage to, let's say their malware starts running network segmentation limitations or not. What do you think really their next step is after they've gotten their foot in the door?
Well, as you might expect, it completely depends on the motivations. I think ransomware people these days will first just start looking around the network for information that their target might consider valuable or sensitive. And this means everything from like looking at an internal wiki or searching through people's email or looking for open network shares or all of the above, really. And these days, also extortion has been a nice stream of revenue for those sorts of people. So what they'll do is before pulling the trigger on ransomware, almost like during this discovery phase, they'll exfiltrate as much data, as much interesting data as they can. That way, if their operation gets compromised, they can still say, okay, that's nice, but we still have your data, pay us or we'll release it. And this is quite common these days. And so it's always one of the first activities for a ransomware style group to engage in. You have the kind of other end. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's interesting you mentioned ransomware in specific, because I think something I've read a lot, especially from CISOs or maybe even people reporting on behalf of CISOs in the scene, is that we can really stop this problem by preventing ransomware payments or banning the payout of ransomware. What do you think about that?
It's a nice thought, but it's not realistic in the end. I think, you know, if your hope is to kill the industry, I think that's going to be a very long battle, and I don't know if you're going to win.
People need operational capability. They're not going to not pay, right?
Absolutely. And even it's funny, I think I heard during the Colonial Pipeline attack. So the FBI will always say, oh, never pay, never pay. And lots of people will say this. But the FBI actually negotiated the payment for the Colonial Pipeline. They did.
Wow.
It's a nice thought. It's a nice thought to make it not worth someone's time. But that's not a realistic approach in the end. It can be, and in an ideal situation, people have backups. People don't need to pay anyone. And, backups are a major part of security. So I would advise that people regularly do backups and take backups seriously, because in the end, it's going to save them. Whatever money you pay for storage is going to be way less than some random person in a sanctioned country demanding you pay them millions of dollars.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense. And at the end of the day, it's not just the fact that you might not get your data back even. It's the fact that, sure, you can't pay the ransom, but who are these people selling the data to? That's
right.
If you're a major aerospace prime, are they selling it to a major aerospace competitor, for example?
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things I want to ask security engineers as we keep running this show is, let's say you have, and I know we weren't privy to having this, at least at least so far in my experience, I wasn't always privy to having the ear of the CISO. If you do have the ear of, many CISOs listening today, what advice would you give them?
I would say, listen to your analysts.
To pay attention to SOC.
I would say that their technical understanding is actually more important than they think it is. I think that, sure, they may trust analysts and incident responders to do their job properly, but I also think that there is a level of misunderstanding that CISOs should invest more time into having a technical security knowledge about. I think it would both save them money, and it would help them understand how to deal with threats in a much more efficient way. I think a lot of CISOs are sold, unfortunately, they're sold products that have either capabilities that they've already got, or frankly are not going to help their situation, and they pay lots of money for a company that promises a lot of things to them that they might not deliver. So I would say increasing your technical knowledge is key, and having, possibly even like having technical people to kind of bounce strategy ideas off of would be a really important and helpful thing to do.
Well, folks, that is the first episode of the Security Engineering Show. Great to have you on today, Grube. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me.